When Helen and I first got married, we lived in town in '53. But then in '56, we moved to the beach.
Where did you meet Helen?
It's a complicated story, described in just a few words. I picked her up.
And you're not sorry you did.
It's a long story, really.
You didn't meet on a blind date or anything like that?
No.
Okay. You kind of thought she was a good-looking young woman, or?
Well, actually, I followed her. She was in a car with a girlfriend, and I was in my car, and they went through the Venetian Island without paying the tolls. And the guy was very upset, so I paid their toll.
Well, that's a nice story. And you've been paying the toll ever since?
No, sometimes she paid it. When I was in law school, she paid all the toll because she worked.
We're going to hear about that. So back to organizing the unions. Was that dangerous work in those days?
Not as a regular thing. No, it wasn't. But there were elements of danger involved in the work. Yes.
Such as?
Well, there were forces on the beach and other parts of Florida that didn't want unions around, and there were fights. People got beaten up, and so it was, to that extent, it was not nice, nice practice, but it was a pleasant practice. That was it. It was. Anyway, when the hotel workers began to organize in 1955, they took over from a hotel and restaurant employees, local 133, which was the bartenders union. The bartenders there were a lot of bars and taverns and restaurants where the bartenders union was prominent. But when they began to organize the hotels in Miami Beach, it became a merger of various locals, and it ended up, the most important one was Local 355, which then organized all the hotels on the beach, which led to the strike. It was a major strike. There were thousands of people out, and it was aimed at the fall or early winter of 1955.
The high season.
Exactly. It was intended that when they all went out on strike, that the hotels had no choice except to say, okay, we'll recognize you and we'll bargain with you.
Did the hotels hire scabs?
Yes.
What was that like?
Well, there were battles in alleys. It's the best I can tell you.
Okay, and there was a picket line then, definitely.
Picket lines on all the hotels, including the Fontainebleau.
That's a pretty big thing.
If you think about it, the Fontainebleau actually was first built, I believe, in '55. I think that's right.
So it had just opened.
That was my impression, yes. But a major event occurred when we went on strike. There was a major lawsuit brought by the hotels against the union, to close down the strike. And since I was essentially a new lawyer, the National Hotel and Restaurant Employees Union brought in another lawyer to work with me. His name was Claude Pepper. And Claude and I were then co-counsel, and we won. There was an injunction suit brought against the hotel workers. We were successful in overcoming the injunction.
What was their rationale for suing the union?
They didn't want to have to negotiate a contract. They didn't want to have to give their workers insurance, health insurance, guaranteed employment. That guaranteed meaning that if they wanted to fire somebody, they'll just fire them at will.
Was it the practice in those days to let them go during the off season and rehire for the
I believe so.
high season?
I believe so.
So they had to scramble for work in between.
Yes.
Who was one of the laborers who was a leader at that time?
A guy named Ross, a guy named Schiffman.
And these were workers at the hotel?
No, these were the heads. These were professional union representatives.
So they were the ones who did most of the public speaking?
Yes, and I did too.
And what kind of response did you get when you spoke?
Well, we were talking to a friend, always to a friendly audience. You know, we didn't open the door to the public and say, "Come on in, and you're going to hear X person speak." My job was to just keep the spirit of the workers going. So we would say, "We're all going to meet here, and come on there, and come to the meeting," and we would talk about how bad the odors of the hotel were to the workers.
Was there any kind of strike fund to help the families?
I don't remember. My impression is yes, but I can't be sure of that.
Did the Miami Herald support this or take a position on the strike?
No, they were non-union at the time, and there was newspaper unions that were organizing the workers at the Miami Herald.
At the same time?
I don't know if it's the same.
Roundabout.
Roundabout.
But did the Miami Herald take an editorial position?
Yes, they were opposed to the strike.
They were going through the same thing basically themselves.
Yes.
So that would have influenced their position, no doubt.
Well, I'm sure.
I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but I'm
No, but
trying
you're
to
right.
clarify the situation.
Yeah, you're right, of course.
So
Plus, you understand that back in the 50s, there was an absolute antipathy to unions. And that's what we were faced with all the time. Not just with the Herald, but with probably the attitude of most people in town.
And why do you think that was?
Want me to discuss the history of the American labor movement?
If you could sum it up.
I would guess that there were a variety of reasons why unions were not accepted. Back in the 20s and 30s, unions were identified as being run by communists. And as a consequence of that, any activity of a union was slandered. And there was very little activity that unions were allowed to engage in without that kind of criticism. But after a while, especially in the construction unions, after a while the unions became very acceptable. There were, for an example, carpenter locals all over the state of Florida, all the way to the Keys, as a matter of fact. And they negotiated with the Associated Contractors, Associated General Contractors, and other organization of construction employers. And everybody got along pretty well, mostly because the people who were in charge of the company were people who had worked their way up from in the ranks. They started out as an apprentice carpenter, worked their way up, and now they owned a company. They didn't think badly of the union. They just said, you know, it doesn't serve my economic interest to negotiate with you. But when they did, they were very loyal, I believe.